Welcome to the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts. In this long-anticipated two-part series, we had the opportunity to sit down with U.S. Army pilot CW5 Allen C. Mack, who authored the riveting book titled Razor 03. In Razor 03, Allen shares his behind-the-scenes perspective of the horse soldiers infill into Afghanistan. He discusses the hunt for Osama bin Laden at Tora Bora and describes his shoot-down during Operation Anaconda. Years later, he chased Bowe Bergdahl. He rescued hostages in Iraq and the lone survivor from the Kunar Valley. He lived by his unit's motto, Night Stalkers don't quit. 10 years of deployments brought Allen's monumental success and crushing sadness. Both provide intriguing accounts of war, love, determination, and emotional resilience. Join us as we discuss Allen's life and experiences as a special operations pilot for the U.S. Army 160th Special Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers. Thank you to our sponsors, CNC Technologies, MD Helicopters, and Technosonic. Cheers.
Welcome to the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts. The Hangar Z podcast is the first and only podcast dedicated to promoting and exploring the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Join your host, John Gray, Jeff Ratkovich, and Jack Shanley.
Still southbound, skidding to a stop. Stand by here. Looks like you're getting ready to bail. Heads up, guys, bailing. Okay, the guy, he's running through the house, jumping the fence, through the shotgun, through something out. Grabbing the shotgun. Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again. He is armed. Stay there. Hold your position.
4 on the stop. You're in custody.
Good advising code 4 on the stop.
Well, because again, we love the time you're giving us, but we're limited. So I'm going to bounce ahead again. And
Sure.
September 11th, September 11th comes around, and the light switch goes on for not only your unit, but for you personally, for a very active, incredibly dangerous situation. Tell us about September 11th and in less than a month, where you were next and what you were doing.
Yeah, so I was at on the 10th of September 2001. I was at Camp Beauregard, Louisiana, doing a JRTC, right, Joint Readiness Training Center. And we were working with 5th Group, 5th Special Forces Group, and we were putting them in maritime teams and Zodiacs into a riverine operation. And they would link up with a Navy Special Boat Unit, and they would take them upriver, and they go do their mission, and we come exfil and that kind of thing. So it's nasty weather. It's a rough night. We get the guys in. We come back. I'm just exhausted from, scud running and, just dealing with the weather and how dark it is out there over the bayous. And I go to bed, and the next morning, we're living in these National Guard barracks, which, they're cinder block barracks, tile floor, probably built in the late 60s, early 70s. And the sound reverberates off the walls, right? So somebody at the far end of the building, can drop a coffee cup, and you're waking up on the other end like, hey, quiet down. And there were guys in the hallway going, holy shit, did you see that? And I'm like, ugh, right? It's like, someone's like, Al, turn on your TV, right? So I get up, I talk about in the book, how primitive, there's no remote, you got to get up and tick, tick, tick. So I get up there, and all the channels had the same thing, there's a smoke coming out of one of the World Trade Center towers. So I'm like, wow, that's something. I was picturing like a small plane hitting it from what they were saying, with an airplane accident. I mean, that happened, the Empire State Building got hit back in the 30s by an airplane. So I'm like, okay, wow, somebody's in trouble. And I'm having some coffee, and all of a sudden, in from the side comes another airplane, hits the other tower. I was like, okay, this is no accident. This is intentional. So we kind of get together, and we're not near any kind of skiff. There's no high side or secret computers for us to deal with. We're in a total training environment, and we don't even have secure phones to talk back to the rear. So the battalion commander and I had just moved from the company across the street to the battalion SIP, a standardization instructor pilot. So I'm like the chief pilot for the battalion. And we drive, 11 hours, 12 hours back to Fort Campbell with a rented car because nobody can fly. Right? You got fighter jets, and that's it, right? There's no airplanes allowed to fly, even us. So we get up there. Now we have access to all the tools and all the information, and we figure out what's going on. And we're told, we believe it's Al Qaeda, they're based out of Afghanistan, and be prepared to deal with that, right? And then as the next day, we're driving down to Tampa, Florida to Special Operations Command, Central Command, SOCCENT at MacDill. And, we've got me, the intel guy, his NCO, supply guy, all the people you would need for pre-deployment surveys and planning. And we also had a guy from 3rd Battalion, 160th, come in from Savannah, Georgia, because they hadn't decided yet who was going to respond. Because we had a 12-ship company of 12 MH-47 Echoes, and we had just cut the company in half and sent 6 of them to Korea, to PACOM, right, the Pacific Command. And what they did in doing so, they had to set them up for success. So they get all the aircraft with high time, until maintenance and such. And they left us we had 5 available to us by the time 9/11 happened. And we sent 4 of those over to Uzbekistan, right? But so now we've got this challenge of we've only got 4 aircraft. And let me back up, right? So, and 3rd Battalion had MH-47 Deltas, which is an older version of what we were flying. And they were supposed to go to, it's called Bright Star. It was a big exercise in Egypt. And so they were going to cancel that and go to Uzbekistan. And we were considered too small at that time to do it. And then it just kept going back and forth, back and forth. And finally, somebody decided we have to hold with our international partners, and we're going to do that exercise to show that America can be attacked and still fulfill its requirements, right? So 3rd Battalion went to Egypt or Qatar or wherever it was, one of those countries doing the big exercise, and we ended up going to Uzbekistan. So, 9/11 happened. I was in Uzbekistan, which is one of the countries just north of Afghanistan, at a base called K2. And we were there October 3rd, I think. So we're talking just a couple of weeks after 9/11. We're already on site. There's another task force on an aircraft carrier south of Afghanistan. They're Task Force Sword, we're Task Force Dagger. And the names are appropriate because we were doing precise clandestine operations, like a stiletto, a nice little dagger. And they were TF Sword, like the big broad, cuts. And they were the ones on CNN hitting Mullah Omar's compound with the Rangers because they wanted, it was like, look over here, all this, America's responding. In the meantime, we're up here, infilling all these ODA teams into what we call the Northern Alliance. And that's where we start.
One of those missions the first mission that comes up is being delayed by weather and all sorts of, mostly weather and conditions and terrain and things. But eventually, you're one of the first aircraft to enter into Afghanistan and drop off special forces. Is that accurate? One of the first?
So the politics come into play here, and not U.S. politics, Afghan politics. So the leader of the Northern Alliance was a guy named Massoud, and he was assassinated by Al Qaeda the day before 9/11. And the reason for that is because he was very charismatic, a good leader. Everybody would follow him in the Northern Alliance. And it was felt that if we could come work with him, we could do exactly what we ended up doing, was take down the Taliban and get to Al Qaeda by just partnering with the Northern Alliance. And with Massoud out of the way, it was felt there was nobody under him or to replace him that would be suitable. A guy named Fahim Khan ended up his second in command. He's a real jerk. Nobody liked him. Sorry, Fahim, if you're watching this, but the truth hurts. And Fahim Khan was going to get the first ODA 555 or triple nickel. And the thing here was he was up in the Panjshir Valley, which is, you got to go to about 25,000 feet to get there. And, the Taliban had all the low terrain. We had to go up over the mountains. Or my friend Andy with Gold Team had to do that. I call him Arlo in the book, But he launches into the mountains and the weather's terrible and he has to turn around. He does it a second night and he has to turn around. And I can't go because Fahim says he will attack General Dostum. That's the guy in the movie 12 Strong. So I flew that ODA in. And I had to wait until Fahim got his guys. And Secretary Rumsfeld, the defense secretary, calls the planning area while we're asleep during the day. And this major picks up the phone. He's like, hello, Task Force Dagger, planning area. And it's like, please hold for the secretary. And he's like, secretary? And he's like, this is Donald Rumsfeld. Who am I talking to? This is Major Jones. And he's like, you tell Mulholland, who was our colonel at the time, he's like, you tell him, get those teams in tonight, both of them, or else. Click. Hangs at the phone. So now the dynamics of the politics have changed. So now, and the problem here is that the other team, gold team, is going to take one of my Chinooks, right? So there's 4 of us. They're going to take one of my Chinooks because they need the extra lift to get over the big mountains, and I'm going over smaller mountains. So they allow me to go single ship with 2 DAPs. Now, DAPs are direct action penetrators or armed Blackhawks. The problem is they're not equipped the same way as I am, and they don't have the performance to get over the mountains. So they're going to, like the fighters in World War II following the B-17s into Germany, they'll follow me as far as they can, and they'll hang back and wait for me to come back out. What we ended up doing was I could land 30 minutes after the ETA for Fahim, right? So Fahim gets his guys 555, and I land 595, who later became known as the horse soldiers because they rode horses into combat with laser-guided munitions and all that stuff. It was pretty cool, actually.
Really cool.
Yeah.
And in the book, when you start describing that initial mission, you're talking about, you talk about the weather and you talk about the terrain. Those 2 things by themselves are huge obstacles. Can you talk about that and your kind of initial experience dealing with those 2 things?
So we were equipped with what we call the multi-mode radar, which does terrain following at either 100-foot clearance altitude, 300-foot, or 500. It also does weather, ground mapping, and such like that. But in this case, it was crucial to get in through the mountains using let me get to it. So we're flying along the DAPs. We're in a dust storm. After we get air refueling, we cross the river and into Afghanistan. And now it's those rolling dunes like you find out near Camp Pendleton in California there. You can't see. And there's mountains in front of us that are probably 14,000 feet high. The DAPs don't have this same radar. I've got a profile view of the radar and I can see the terrain ahead, and they're sucked up next to me, at my 5 and 8 o'clock position. And they're with their night vision goggles, all they can see is the glow of my engines, right? So as we start a climb for a hill or whatever, the glow picks up and they know we're climbing and they just match it with the collective and they stay with us. And you know how hard it is to fly formation off somebody when you can't see the attitude of the aircraft, right? It's tough. And they're doing it. I mean, these guys had some brass cojones, and they didn't last long, though. They weren't great brass. They lasted, I don't know, 3-4 minutes, maybe 5. And they were like, hey, we got to go. And they turned around and they left. Now it's just me, my aircraft. When I say me, remember, I'm with a crew. And the battalion commander's in my jump seat, which is a little seat, just behind and between me and the other pilot. And he's like, what do you think, Al? And I said, sir, I think we TF. He's like, go ahead. I did not think he'd say yes because the terrain following radar, TF, we'd never been allowed to use it for real. I mean, you could use it, but you had to, on the risk assessment for training, you'd have to get a general officer to approve it. So here's the quandary, right? You had to get on a military training route, an MTR, right? Where you could do the IR. Like we had IR 89, I think, flew down from Nashville down to Atlanta, Georgia, and back through the little mountains there. So you had to fly IFR, get a let down to the TFR. You had to have weather bad enough, not TFR, the MTR. You had to have weather bad enough to actually have, IMC conditions, so you couldn't see out the window. And you had to meet all those requirements and still be able to get to your destination with minimums, right? Physically impossible to do. You can't line that stuff up, right? So all you could do is use the simulator, which is not the same because there's no death involved. You freeze. So the only thing we could do is we would fly along at night on a dark night, and the guy on the flight controls would flip his NVGs up so he was unaided. And, you're down at 100 feet, so you really can't see much. But the other pilot would act as the safety pilot. Like if the Q, as we call it, the power Q wasn't good enough and you weren't going to clear the hills, he'd just take the controls and save the day kind of thing. So we didn't know if the damn thing was going to work in this case because the mountains were bigger than we've ever been in. I mean, out in Colorado, Pikes Peak's like 14 something. And in this case, I was, only had 14, but we had, 20,000 foot mountains in the background, and we're flying along, and I activated the Q, my co-pilot's on it. And, it's a little up and down arrow. that tells you what to do with what we call the thrust of the collective. And everything's working fine until we make our first turn. And the radar looks out about 10 miles when it comes to the power queue. And we turn, and there's a mountain in the way that's 12, 13,000 feet tall, but I don't know. I can't see it. It's not, we haven't really planned this thing for the TF, and we've never done these kind of mountains. So I'm scrolling through the digital map, trying to figure out what's the radar queuing off of. And eventually I see this, 12,000 foot mountain in front of us. So all I did is I instead of following the course, the flight management system, what we call IAS, Integrated Avionics System, instead of flying the IAS driven course, I just gave him a heading, and the little flight director cue turns off to the right. He follows that. The radar led us back down into the valley. And once I was past it, we just rejoined the course, and we went, and we didn't have any more hiccups. And we learned in that mission, how to plan a route. So essentially what you ended up doing is, instead of, like, let's say a route might take you 10 aerial checkpoints, you might use 20 or 30 to make sure that if the aircraft is driving itself, it's never pointing at something that you don't want to command off of, so it's a little more complex in the planning. And then that's where I told the tight spot thing,
Damn, we're in a tight spot.
We're in a tight spot.
Everybody's all wound up. And once I figure out what we're doing and I get us turned off and we start letting down, it's like, oh, damn, we're in a tight spot. And Jethro, the co-pilot, he picked up on it. He's like, yeah, we're in a tight spot. The crew's just like, are you guys messing around? And like,
no, we're really in a tight spot.
Yeah, we are in a tight spot. It's like, damn, my hair. But so then we go into the last couple miles, and we're still not out of the clouds. And I've got one ridge line to get over. It's a couple thousand feet above the landing zone. We come across it. I lower the queue to 100 feet instead of 300, and we're coming down. And we pop out of the clouds, and I can see where I think it is. There's no IR strobe. There's no lighting. There's no laser back then. And it's just a CIA guy on the ground, and he doesn't have any of those tools.
Thank you to our sponsor, CNC Technologies. CNC Technologies, serving law enforcement, government, and military markets with tailored mission solutions, system training, and live 24/7 support with CNC.live platform. Explore more at cnctechnologies.com.
Like, you ever driven your car using Waze or Google Maps, and you're like, okay, here comes the turn right about you. And it's like, you pass it and it's like, turn left now. And it's like, damn it. Well, it's the same thing with the GPS over there. It's like, so it can be tough. And the problem was, just to the north of that was a ZPU 23-4, which is a 23 millimeter 4-barreled anti-aircraft gun. Right. And so it's like a little bit bigger than a 50 cal, for those who know those kind of bullets. And he's just behind like a little hill, right? Just a little nub, and just enough that he can't, based on the angle we're at, he can't see me and I can't see him. And I'm like, if I can see him, he'll be able to see me and he'll shoot us out of the sky. So we're coming down off this mountain, and I got to lose, 2,000-3,000 feet in the course of about 2-3 miles. And so you can't just let it down. So we did S turns, like you would maybe trying to make with an auto rotation, trying to make a landing zone. And so I'm doing it because I'm the more experienced pilot, and I'm very aggressive with the controls. And we're coming down. I mean, we're pegged out at like 3,500 feet a minute on the VSI. We get to the bottom, and I realize it's time to turn inbound now for the actual landing, but I can't see the landing area, and it's zero illume. It's super dark, a lot of dust in the air. And I'm like, Jethro, you got the landing area in sight? And he's like, yeah. Well, I said, you have the controls, right? And he takes them and he turns inbound. And I really hosed him on that, because normally when we're doing this kind of what we call loss of visual reference approach, you set up the magnetic brakes on the controls, so you'll set the controls, you press a button, and it will essentially hold that position with a magnet. You can push against the springs with your hand and override it, but generally you don't press the thing again. And so he didn't have an opportunity to do that. So he had to fly in with the force trim turned off and do it all. So you tend to over control a little bit, and he comes in and he takes a big angle like this, and we're totally browned out. I'm looking at the hover symbology, and it looks like we're starting to back up. And I call go around. I'm like, God, Jethro, go around. We're going backwards. And all of a sudden I feel the aft landing gear touch the ground. And I'm like, we are not going around. So he's in the middle of pulling the controls up, and I lean on it with my left hand, and I'm all my weight on it. And this guy's big. I mean, he's 230 pounds of muscle, V shape, he could pick me up with his little finger. And we have the same, nobody has an advantage on the hydraulics. They're the same, right? And I'm trying, and there's a lot of commotion going on. People are talking, and finally he realizes what I want, and he must have felt it as well. And he just lowers the controls. The forward gear comes down, jam on the brakes, and we just settle, and we let the dust come to and now I see we're surrounded by all these Afghan men wearing the puck holes. That's those flat hats you see in the movie 12 Strong. And they got AK-47s. I'm like, the Taliban dresses the same as the Northern Alliance. I don't know. And the guy that's out there is a CIA guy. So he's dressed in local garb. So I'm like, oh, I hope we're in the right spot. Right? And so they lower the ramp. The team gets out. They, do their little greetings and stuff. And they end up hugging. Team leader comes around to the front where I can see him through the chin bubble. He taps on the plexiglass, and he's like, okay, see ya. So we take off and reverse the course. And then we ended up doing that every single night for the next, I don't know, we put in, so in the movie, it's just the one team, but we put in like 21 teams around the country. And the flight lead and I talk about this in the book, the other flight lead, so there's two of us, we sneak off, and one of the agency guys had given us a bottle of Jack Daniels, and he was the main, the keeper of the bottle. I was like, Andy, let's go do our thing. And so we pour, a little cup of bourbon, and we're sitting there talking, and we got a couple of missions under our belt. We're like, what do you think, man? And he's like, I don't think we're going to live. I said, yeah, I don't either. We honestly, so you know what? It's funny. I'm watching. So on the way over, I read a book about the 8th Air Force in World War II doing the daylight precision bombing. And I'm currently watching that show on Apple, Masters of the Air, right? And so there are 3 episodes in, and these guys are flying into Germany. The flak and the fighters are tearing them up, and they're having gigantic losses. And they're sitting there going, how are we going to do this? And it's the same conversation. I'd like to think it's the same, I know it's not, Messerschmitt's coming at you, but the terrain and weather are going to kill us. And we know it because the radar has a tendency of rebooting. That's what I didn't tell you about that first part. The reason they don't let you do it is because, you ever had your iPhone or your computer break up on you and you got to reset it, hard reboot? The radar would do that. And in the meantime, you got to avoid hitting whatever's out there and get the damn thing rebooted, back online. And so we honestly didn't think we'd survive, another flight.
It's incredible. The one thing, that common theme that I kept thinking about as I was reading Razor 03 is, damn, Al was a test pilot. I mean, it was like you guys were test pilots while you're fighting a war and learning and teaching yourselves about systems.
You're exactly right. I mean, think of the test pilot program at China Lake back in the day with Chuck Yeager, and it's like, well, let's see what happens when we do this. That's exactly what happened, and there are procedures in place now that we invented back then. You come back and you always do an after-action review. All right, what worked? What didn't work? What could we do different next time? And the other team, they would. The difference is they would fly with the jog air, so 1/250 map, right? And they would follow the contour lines exactly. And I'm like, the mountains are too big. But by the time you're counting contour intervals, you're screwed. You've got to have a much bigger picture here. So I had a different way of approaching it, and we learned a lot. And like I said, almost everything they do now, the aircraft that they have now, the way the cockpit is set up, as the battalion SIP, I was actually the guy that wrote the memorandum for how we were going to do the cockpit. And the actual layout in the cockpit is, I've still got the memos where I wrote, here's what we want.
Obviously, I wasn't the one flying the mission, but as you're describing this, and as I'm reading this in the book, my heart rate's going up thinking about, what you're facing as a pilot. We're taught to avoid the clouds at all cost. And here you are entering the clouds, and you've got this radar system that really all it's done is proven that it fails. It works, but it's proven to fail. And now you're relying on the system to get you to where you need to be. Donald Rumsfeld called and said, you will be here at this time, which that's a whole nother conversation. We talk about political pressure and the pressures to fly. How did you...
And John, so here's the thing. So remember I said we didn't plan the route to TF, right? So one of the things we learned was to plan every route to this day, in Afghanistan in particular, in many places, every route is planned to be able to TF, meaning you have to have the aircraft performance to do it. Every leg has what we think of an instrument flight, right? We call it MEA, minimum route altitude. And in our case, instead of being 1,000 or 2,000 feet above the terrain, it was 500 feet. So if your radar failed, each map had a nib on the side of the route, right? The heading, distance, time, and the MEA, right? Minimum route altitude. So you'd cross a checkpoint. You say, okay, crossing checkpoint 10, turn right 238. Clock started for elapsed time. It's going to take us 10 minutes. MEA is 12,500 feet. If the radar fails, all you do is you just climb to 12,500 feet, couple the altitude, and you're just doing essentially a low-level flight coupled. But and that's only within a quarter mile, right? So those mountains are so big, you would normally be, half mile or whatever, distance from obstacles. This is a much more compact thing, but that's one of the things they do now. And the tools that they have to plan now will do it for you. You'll set the parameters and it'll tell you the thing, and you just print it out for you on the map and on your time distance heading card. Back then, what we did is you'd move the mouse back and forth, about a quarter inch left and right of the course line, and you'd read the DTED, the Defense Terrain Elevation Data, and you'd write it down. And then you'd have another guy do it. 3 people would do it. And the rule was you could never go lower than the guy before you. So if somebody found a spot elevation on the way that was 12,000 feet and everybody else was like 9,000, you went with the higher one, because you're just literally, who knows what you got in there. And that, so those tools got improved over time, which really was helpful.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing.
And of course, nowadays you have in your map, and you see this like in a lot of the EMS aircraft now, and in the law enforcement, you'll if there's terrain higher than you, it'll show up as red or yellow in the map. So that came, as time went by, but we didn't have that in the early days.
I thought this over and over when I was reading your book, that the bullets were almost mildly interesting. I mean, bullets, RPGs, there's a risk there, but you also have guns in the back. You can defend yourself. You have chaff. You can maneuver. But this weather and terrain stuff it made my heart race, just like John said. I just said the risk there was almost overwhelming when I was reading it.
I would take my chance against the enemy before I would do it against the weather. Terrain and weather is the toughest thing.
Yeah.
In your book, what do you say, 100% kill ratio or something to that effect?
Yeah, so terrain? every munition that's shot at an aircraft has a probable kill ratio, or PK, right? So if you fire a SA-7 surface-to-air missile, manpad at an aircraft, it has a 75 PK, right? Meaning, and I'm just making that up right now to give you an example, but it'd be like, it has a 75% chance probable kill of your aircraft, right? And we would say that, the missile's got a 75 PK and the ground has, 100%. If you hit cumulo granite, you're not going to survive, no matter how big your falls are.
Well, one thing we really have to get to here is, and again, we're fast forwarding to another mission, and you had dozens, if not hundreds of missions in between all this, is Operation Anaconda. And we'd love for you to talk to us about that and your mission to Takur Ghar, that mountaintop. Some of our listeners have read Robert's Ridge and Alone at Dawn, certainly 2 fantastic books about this exact operation and events. But we have here one of the pilots that flew that. And so now, from your perspective, take us through that, and we can get ready for our hearts to race again, John, because I can tell you when I read this part of the book, I was tense. I don't recall reading something where I felt like that. You really got the point across really well, Al, in what happened there and the chain of events and the tragedies. And now we have you here. So Go ahead and walk us through that a little bit.
That could be an hour conversation on its own, so I'm going to shrink it up a little bit. We've been in Afghanistan a couple of months. We're getting ready to rip out relief in place with our sister company. And we're told, well, before you leave, you're going to have to participate in Operation Anaconda, which is a conventional mission with the 101st and 82nd Airborne. Our role as a task force was to emplace special operations teams on mountain passes that would cover lines of communication or roads, high-speed escape or ingress, right? And the thought was that Al-Qaeda would probably try to run because we were going to use what they call the hammer and the anvil, right? So the anvil is the mountains with the SF guys on top. And these are coalition forces, the Germans, the Brits, the Americans, the Canadians. And the hammer is an Afghan force led by SF guys, and they're going to drive the Al-Qaeda to drop bombs on them. That's the goal anyway. And my role in this is just, I'm supposed to sit by with 2 aircraft with a bunch of SEAL Team 6 guys. And the problem is we think bin Laden and Zawahiri, his number 2, are present. So, but we're not sure. The main goal is to drive Al-Qaeda in a direction and destroy them. But if bin Laden and Zawahiri are there, that they got to have somebody dedicated to that. So that's my team, Razor 03 and Razor 04. And I've got the SEAL Team 6 Recce element is my guys. And it becomes apparent. So if he pops up, we're going to go schwack him, with the 2 Chinooks. We're going to go run him down and do a vehicle interdiction. It's obvious he's not there after a period of time. And the conventional forces are getting their ass handed to him because there was bad weather and Anaconda was slipped a week or 2. And, being good-natured people, we went around, the U.S. went around telling the NGOs, the UN, Red Cross, Red Crescent, hey, by the way, on March 1st, you probably don't want to be here because there's a big operation. Well, okay. So the Taliban and Al-Qaeda know this thing's coming. And all they did was assume fighting positions from the old Soviet time. And there's only so many places in these mountains you can land helicopters. So they've got what we call range cards set up. They already know the range from this fighting position, this mortar or rocket position to a landing zone. They know the heading, they know the distance, they know exactly what angle it's going to take to hit that. So these guys are getting their ass handed to them by no fault of their own. Somebody says, well, gee, if only we could get somebody with eyes on this part of the valley, we could call for fire and really free these guys up. So they said, well, apparently Zawahiri and bin Laden aren't here. Let's get Al to take his team over to Takur Ghar, which is the biggest mountain in the area. And the plan was to pick them up down in Gardez, which is nearby, fly them to the base of Takur Ghar and come home, right? Because back then there's no gas down there, no fuel, no jet fuel. So what you leave Bagram with is what you're getting home with. So you're kind of limited to what you can carry and what you can do. So anyway, we go down there, we pick them up, we're going to fly in, and there's a B-52 strike coming in. So I get turned around, I get told to land and wait. Okay, you're watching the B-52s come in, they're dropping their bombs, and once they pass, the 101st is going to now come in with a big air assault again. So I'm launching, I get turned around again. What's happening now is I'm using up fuel and I'm using up night. So we decide to shut down. And the problem is the aircraft I had a problem with a generator swap. So when you go from main generators to the auxiliary power unit, the relays would stick in this aircraft from dust or whatever. And so some of the components didn't do well, by being, it's almost like unplugging your computer when something's running and a file gets corrupted. Although this isn't a file, this is, the little computers on the engines and such. So time comes to go. All right, Al, you can go. All right, we crank up, and the number 2 engine, the engine on the right side, has a hot start. Too much fuel gets injected during the start process. All the needles go into the red.
Thank you to our sponsors, MD Helicopters. MD Helicopters is a leading light helicopter manufacturer for civil and military operators worldwide. We build safe, agile, hard-working light helicopters that consistently deliver reliable performance. As a result, our operators enjoy superior confidence, backed by durability that enables more uptime.
I've never seen the needles go that high. I'm like, oh no, I cannot take these guys to the top of a 10,000 foot mountain with one engine, right? So I call Razor 1 and Razor 2 had just returned to Bagram. They were getting gas from some missions they were doing. And I said, hey, you need to send them to me and swap. Like I'll jump in the aircraft and take them, and they'll take these back. They'll bring a maintenance pilot down to recover this one, and we'll go finish. But it's a 45-minute flight. We are now at a point where there's no way to land at the base of the mountain and let the SEALs walk to the top under the cover of darkness. And they're like, we're not doing that in the daylight. We need you to take us right to the top. Now, I haven't been planning on this. I have no imagery of the top. And back then, good imagery was hard to come by. Now it's amazing, right? I mean, Google Earth is better than what we had. We basically had a topographic map. So anyway, they come down, and the crew chiefs recommend that we only swap the pilots because it'll be quicker. And we're just going to the top of the mountain. It's supposed to be clear, of enemy. And there's AC-130 overhead looking at it. He says there's nothing up there. So we take off. And Chalk 2, Razor 04, drops off and lands to a separate LZ to drop his element off. And I continue up to the top of the mountain. We land up there, snow-covered hill, and there's footprints across the snow. Now, that's not uncommon. We've seen people at, 20,000 feet, like in the middle of nowhere. It's like, what the hell is that guy doing up here? But we didn't see anybody. We just saw the footprints. And we came in, landed. We saw a Dishka, which is a 14.5 millimeter anti-aircraft machine gun on a tripod. It's like a 50 cal-ish kind of thing, and a donkey. Now, back then, the team leader, the assault team leader, they all had their own headsets. They could talk to each other, like in the movies, but he couldn't talk to the pilots. So he had to take off his headset and put on one of our headsets. Now, that means he can't talk to his guys, but he can talk to me. So we land. He's like, all right, I'm coming off headset. He takes off the aircraft headset. He's putting on the team headset. And that's when the crew chiefs are like, sir, there's a Dishka over here. There's nobody on it. There's a donkey. And we've seen a guy to the left. Okay. Do you still see him? Is he armed? And they're like, we don't see him anymore. We couldn't tell if he was armed. And based on a couple of things that happened, a day or so before with a friendly fire incident, we had to be shot at before we could return fire. Although there's a caveat to that. So that's hostile act. Someone does a hostile act to you, you can return fire. But there's also a caveat for hostile intent, which is more difficult. Now I've got to decide somebody intends to hurt me. And in this case, I told the gunner, look, at this point, if that guy pops up again, kill him, because there's no way he's friendly. So the team leader's putting his headset on. I give him the spiel about the donkey and the gun and the guy. He's like, okay. So he takes his headset off again. And right at that moment, he's in between headsets. The guy that we had seen comes from a different angle, and he lets an RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, fly. I'm watching this thing come at me. It looks like a lava lamp with sparks coming out the back. It's like in slow motion. And it hits just behind me. I'm in an armored seat, and it hit between me and the fuel tank. So had he hit a little bit further back, chances are we would have blown up right then. Or if he had hit the cockpit, I'd have been killed and we'd been done. But he hit right between us. The RPG went through the left ammo can for the minigun, and then out the other side, a big explosion inside the aircraft, caught the soundproofing on fire, and put everybody kind of in a situation where they couldn't talk. And it was kind of like, a cartoon with the crew chiefs are in the back with like little birds and stars going around their head. And blah, blah, blah. And so the crew chief in the very back says, he says, fire in the cabin, go, go, go. And I didn't know if he meant the explosion or if we were taking machine gun fire, because you could hear, ting, 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 ting. And so we were getting shot at by machine guns now, and you had that big fire in the back. So they put the fire out. We go to take off, and as I rotate up, the aircraft generators are offline now. So the cockpit is completely black. All the MFDs, the little TV screens, they're black. And I've got some backup instruments. I've got a little attitude indicator and a compass, and that's it. What I didn't realize, we actually had a backup attitude indicator from Goodrich, it's called an ESIS or a BAI. It had airspeed, heading, altitude, all that kind of stuff, but I didn't even notice that. I was looking at the other old steam gauges. As we lift off, the engines are in reversionary mode or backup, systems, right? So they don't keep up with the droop. So we're at, I don't know, 10,000-ish feet. So when I pull the power and you can feel the rotors slow down, you can hear it go. Rrr. And so I figure I lost the engine. So I dive down the mountain. It's very steep. And my goal is to build up rotor RPM to essentially, I don't have single engine capability. So I know I'm going to crash at the bottom of the hill, but at least I'll have full RPM and I might be able to either just essentially auto rotate to the bottom or maybe do a roll on controlled. So as I'm diving down, what I don't realize is Navy SEAL Neil Roberts and one of my crew chiefs have fallen out the back ramp. The gunner is on a tether, right? So he's hanging below the ramp and I'm diving down, probably doing about 140 knots. His feet are tickling the pine trees and I don't know he's out there, right? And I'm trying to avoid being shot at by the Dishka because they're shooting at us still. So I'm trying to, use that kind of cover. And the crew chief in the back says, "Hey, sir, we got both engines, level off. We got both engines." And I'm like, "Are you sure? I've got no indications in the cockpit." And he's like, "Yeah, I can hear. I'm standing between the engines." All right. So I level off and now we're about, 9,000 feet or so as opposed to 12. He says, "We lost a guy at the back." I'm like, "What? What do you mean we lost a guy?" I'm like, "Get a head count." And I mean, they watched him go out the back. They don't have the head count, but I'm kind of in denial here. I'm like, "Get a head count." And about that time, the controls freeze up and you cannot move the controls in a Chinook without hydraulic fluid. And we'd taken damage on the return side of the hydraulics. And every time we moved the controls, it squirted out hydraulic fluid. Like if we hit the pressure side, it would have just been one big pink cloud and that'd have been that. So I got a couple of movements, lasted about 50 seconds per can. So now I can't move the controls. My co-pilot's trying to get on there. I swear we bent the cyclic trying to move it.
I'll bet.
Just in denial. And the crew chief in the back, there's a little fill port back there. And he opens up, think of how oil used to come, not in those nice plastic bottles. It used to be in a can, right? A little quart can. So he pops holes in the can and he pours it in the reservoir. And there's a little tiny T-handle, in the back, right? And he's like pumping it like this. Pumping that into the system, and all of a sudden the controls are restored. And I'm like, "Guys, I got the controls. We're turning back. We're going back to get that guy." So we bank around. We're coming in, and the controls lock up again. We're on long final, and I'm like, shit, we're done, And then the crew chief's like, does it again, another can, and he's like, "How's that?" I'm like, "Oh, I have a control, but now I know there's no way I can land there without systems. The guns don't work because they're electric." And they're now battery powered. Back then they were off the generators. And so I did another bank and I tried to make it to where where Razor 04 had put his guys. I tried to make it down there and I figured, okay, at least we'll land with friendlies. I can see the whole battle unfolding beneath. There's, tracer fire going back and forth and explosions going off. It's like something out of a movie. And we ended up coming in to land. And just before we landed, I put it in a landing attitude. I had where I wanted to go. And I no longer could move the cyclic, right? And we start a slide to the right, just a gentle slide. But there's a hill to my right side. And if you don't arrest the slide, we're going to hit that thing sideways and we are going to roll into the hill and we're going to explode, movie explosion. And there's a saying, right? Never stop flying the aircraft. So I can't move my right hand, but I try pushing on the right pedal. And the pedal swings around, puts me in the direction of the slide, and now we're at least going in the direction of movement. And now I can't move it anymore. I got like one push on it. We brush the ground. I push down on the power, and that's the last I have with that. And we settle on about a 20-ish degree left side low cross slope, probably about 10 or 15 degrees nose high, and it's pretty soft. I thought. The crew chiefs in the back were like, "Damn, sir." I was like, "Hey, we're alive." And I pulled the engines offline and my co-pilot jammed on the rotor brake. And eventually we spent about 45 minutes on the ground and there was an AC-130 overhead protecting us. Friendlies knew where we were. John Chapman, the Air Force controller, who later got the Medal of Honor later that night, was talking to the AC-130. Britt Slabinski, the SEAL team leader, also got the Medal of Honor that night for their actions back on the hill. So Razor 04 comes to get us. he does not have the performance to take all of us to the top of the hill. So he flies us back to Gardez. It's about a 10-minute flight, drops off all the excess equipment the SEALs aren't going to need because they're not staying up there now. And he flies them to the top of the hill. His aircraft is shot to heck. And I'm at the FOB at Gardez, the forward operating base. And then he comes back and his aircraft is now non-flyable. And there's all kinds of confusion going on about what aircraft's where and who's out of gas. And he actually had zero gas left. The engine, the number one engine and the APU flamed out. So he had no gas. And a bunch of wire bundles were shot through. I mean, heroic actions putting those guys back in. And so we were there while they were up there. They've got their own story to tell, being up there.
It's an amazing story up there, what's going on, really.
Because Razor 01 comes back with the aircraft. You know, they had come got my aircraft. They went back to Bagram. They have the quick reaction force. So now they come back with one of the aircraft and another one. And Razor 01 is shot down on top of the mountain. Same spot I had been shot up. Same kind of situation. The only difference was he was maybe 75 meters further back than me. Where I was able to lift and dive down the hill, he actually impacted on the upslope. Yeah. And then they were up there for the day and the night. So,
yeah. And that pilot, as I recall, it's been a while since I read those, he had a severe injury, didn't he? I mean, at least one of the pilots?
Well, so one of the right gunner was shot and killed, a guy named Phil Svitak, amazing guy. He was hit below the body armor. The right seat pilot, the co-pilot, a guy named Greg, he was shot in the left hand. He still has his hand. He actually flies, he flew commercial for a while now. I think he's flying air ambulance. But he took 3 AK rounds to his hand, and he got shot in the chest plate, like right at his heart. It didn't go through. The pilot in command, the flight lead, actually was shot in the femur, and he had some interest. You know, bullets do funny things, right? So he had some of the folds in his uniform had bullet holes through them, leading right to his crotch. And he's I don't know where that bullet went. He says it hit it right for home. You know, it didn't get the boys. And then the air mission commander in the jump seat got his fingertip shot off, and the other gunner was shot in the thigh. Except he had a sheath knife hanging down. It actually hit the knife. And the steel of that, you know, he still splayed his leg open like a Christmas ham, but he still had his leg. And that was a 14.5 round hit him, but he's still walking around now. So
incredible. And
a bunch of the Rangers were unfortunately killed when they were trying to get off the aircraft because the bullets just come right through the sheet metal. You know, they didn't stand a chance.
That whole incident, no matter what angle you read it from the SEAL perspective, from the Ranger perspective, from the combat controller's perspective, or the SOAR perspective, is absolutely incredible. And thank you for sharing that. I know that's probably tough to think about and talk about, but you did an incredible job. Your crew, oh my gosh. I kept thinking about the person that's back there pumping that hydraulic fluid.
So he hurt his back on the landing. Remember I said I thought it was soft, and he's like, oh, damn, sir. So he hurt his back. And, you know, a year or two later, he's like, sir, it's your fault. My back hurts. I'm like, no, it's your fault. And he's like, what do you mean? I go, well, you put the hydraulic fluid in. We would have all just died a smoking hole, and your back wouldn't be a problem. And he's like, I just thought of it that way. But, you know, and a lot of lessons came out of that. You know, that's the one strength I think about the 160th, other than, you know, the people, is the training. And the training is based on, as I said, real world conditions. In this case, we would learn what we did right and wrong and apply that and make sure everybody knew it, to include the ground force, you know. And I got to work with everybody, you know, Delta, SEAL Team 6, the SF guys, the Rangers. And so I could share that with them if they were willing to listen. In some cases they were, in some cases they weren't, you know, but I'm still here, which is good. We're coming up on the anniversary for that, March 3rd and 4th. So,
well, we're glad that you're here and you saved your aircraft and your crew that day. That was amazing. Amazing. I know we're running out of time here. You've been very generous, Alan. And we're going to skip over one of the things, and we'll just say that if you read Razor 03, you can read about Operation Red Wings, which is the lone survivor incident, which Al was also involved in toward the back end of that. And that's an amazing story too. And I will ask you one question about that. We won't go into it at length. We'll tease it because it's really an amazing thing. But I want to ask you one question about that. One thing that was really unique that jumped out at me was when you guys went in for that final rescue attempt to pick up Marcus Luttrell. You know where he is. You're going to get him. You coordinated that as a flight lead with Air Force rotorcraft, with yourself, with A-10s, with AC-130s, all sorts of air assets. And that jumped out at me. I know flight leads are responsible for a lot of things, but was that unique where you're timing the gunfire and timing where it is? Was that unique for you as a flight lead, or was that something you did multiple times through your position?
Thank you to our sponsor, Technisonic Communications. Technisonic Communications is a proud provider of the critical airborne communications equipment utilized every day on every mission. Law enforcement, EMS, forestry, federal and military operators all trust their communications to Technisonic. Visit TIL.ca to learn how Technisonic can support your mission communications.
This was unique in that I did it all the time. I mean, coordinating fires and things like that, always. But this was so tight, the tolerances here, and the enemy was in such a position where, the Air Force HH-60 was going to be vulnerable. And then, as they came out, I was coming in with more people because we still had people to find, from the original team. So instead of just, filling out an email or talking to the liaison about, hey, I need these kind of fires, I talked to the HH-60. I gave him a route that I wanted to use and the timing. They stripped the aircraft down to nothing, and those guys get some brass ones. But I sat down at a table with the AC-130 planners, or the actual crews, and the A-10 pilots with my map, and showed them what I was intending to do. I said, "Look, here's what I need." Right, and I didn't tell them what to use. I mean, that's the one thing I learned over the years as a flight leader is you don't ask for a specific munition from an AC-130 or a fighter. You ask for an effect. Here's what I need. I need this to happen at this time. And they would tell me, okay, the last round can be in the air at this time. You'd be like, the last round in the air would be like, 25 seconds, right? So you've got to give us this much notice to not shoot the next round, right? So you don't get blown up as you come in. So when the 60 came in, they would what we call lift and shift, right? So they lift the fire, stop firing on that position, and pick something else. And to this day, I consider that my best work was that mission. And and the guys, the Air Force was amazing. I don't usually have a lot of nice things to say about them, but they were fantastic.
It's an honor to sit here and talk to you about this. It kind of comes full circle for me in a lot of ways. I became a consumer of podcasts listening to the Team Never Quit podcast with Marcus Luttrell. He talked about a lot of this stuff. Obviously, the story turned into a movie, and all these things that are written out in your book turn into multiple movies and multiple different books. Like I told my wife when I was getting ready for this conversation that your story could be a movie by itself. There's probably too many chapters to that to be a singular movie.
To your point, if there's anybody out there that would like to take this on as a project, give me a call.
Oh man,
Brad Pitt's on the phone right now.
Well, here's the thing though, right? So if you ever see a picture of me in uniform, I've got a lot of awards, right? And people that don't know any better will say, "Oh, wow, you had a lot of awards." And I go, "Yeah, you know what that means?" I go, like the bottom two rows is all like gimmies. You served during this time and that. I said, all the stuff on the top two rows, that's either overcoming my own fuck ups or somebody else's.
Yeah.
And so the goal for any mission is to not have a good story, not a good beer story. Like, oh my God, there I was. Right. And in many cases, the ones that I do have that are in the book, they weren't my problems. I was responding to somebody else's, and you're at a disadvantage in that case. But the cool thing is I survived because of the training that I had, the people that I was with, or the people I was working with. I mean, that's the one thing people ask me all the time. Hey, do you miss flying? And no, not really. I mean, I wouldn't mind doing it, but I miss the people. I miss those folks.
Yeah, we say that all the time. Yeah, the flying. Yeah, there's parts of flying I would love to do, but boy, do I miss the people.
The shenanigans.
Yeah,
the shenanigans.
Sure.
Yes.
Yep.
Oh yeah, we could do a whole show just on shenanigans.
Oh yeah. Oh, we could. But as a matter of fact, John and I were talking yesterday and saying that one of our favorite things in the book was the smokers, non-smokers tent.
Oh, right.
And we'll just leave it at that and let the readers. You got to go read that because that was hilarious. And it was so typical. It made me think of cops doing the exact same thing. And
there's a guy. We unfortunately he's late, as in he died this past year. We called him Tricky, right? Because he was always doing these practical jokes. And so he had just like that day on my laptop changed out the M and the N, right? You pulled the keys off and switched them, right? So if you're touch typing, it's no big deal, right? But every once in a while, you're kind of looking down and saying, "Oh, something's wrong here." But oh yeah, and so you can't figure out why it's doing the wrong letter, or he'd change the autocorrect on your PowerPoint or Word, so you're writing these slides for the general, and it's like today's instead of mission, it might be today's sex party will be, and you're like, what the hell? And because it would just autocorrect and change it, and so they were out flying late. And I got into their hooch and I pulled the dry erase board off the door. It was like screwed on with like 6 screws. And I put an alarm clock behind it, and screwed it back up on the wall and set it for when I knew they'd be, asleep. And this damn thing would go off. And, it's always,
right.
tit for tat,
Oh, yeah. Well, we can't let you go without one thing. And John and I talk about this all the time, the reach of the podcast and how it reaches people, and then they contact us or something happens. And one of the things that happened with our episodes with Dave Ritchie and Cal Dockery was that we got to talking, about you, which led us to you because they said, "Oh, you got to talk to Al," But then in talking to you, you made contact with another guest of ours who we're very proud of to know, and we call him a friend, and that's Jimmy Hatch. That's episodes 100 and 101. Jimmy Hatch he's SEAL Team 6 canine guy that was wounded. Go listen to those episodes, folks, because it's powerful. But anyway, tell us about the connection with you and Jimmy Hatch that you learned through the Hangar Z podcast.
Yeah. So interesting. I didn't know who he was name-wise, right? And like most of the time I was overseas, I dealt with the troop chief, the troop, commander, troop leader, whatever. And the rank and file guys, I didn't, I might say hi to them, joke around a little bit, but I didn't even know their names, right? And they all had beards, and, it actually does a pretty good job of hiding who they are. And in the first couple of years, they were actually under alias, right? So names that I learned weren't even their real names. So oftentimes they go with nicknames. I talked to Cal, and I watched you guys' episodes with him and Dave, and we talked about Jimmy Hatch. I'm like, okay. So I start searching him, and you guys are letting him know that I'm probably going to try to reach out to him. I'm a real person, that kind of thing. And I found him I think on Instagram or LinkedIn or something. And I reached out and said, hey, I'm Al Mack. I was a flight lead with the 160th. It sounds like we've been together a little bit, same kind of time frame. We probably have worked together. And he writes back and he's like, Al, yeah, I know you for sure. I'm like, okay. So I said, hey, would you like to exchange books? So I sent him a copy of my book, Razor 03, Night Stalkers Wars. And he sent me his Touching a Dragon. And what was interesting is, so I actually listened to it on Audible and before I got the book. And I was like, oh my God, we have definitely crossed paths, right? As a matter of fact, he talked about getting bit by one of the dogs that wasn't his, that he was working. And I'm like, I sat down and talked to him about that, like when it happened. So I wrote back again. I was like, dude, we have definitely crossed paths, right? And he read the book and he's like, oh yeah, we definitely had worked together. So it's a small world, and he's an amazing guy, and his organization I find very interesting, especially because now I'm in public safety. So I'm a deputy commissioner of emergency services for Orange County, New York, and I work closely with the SOG team for the sheriff's office and state police and all that. And it's fun. It's a lot like being in JSOC. I mean, you got the cops, the firefighters, the EMS, the FEMA guys. It's a lot like, Navy, Air Force, Army. And, we all hate each other and we go do the job and then we drink beer together and then we go back to hating each other again. But it's fun.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad the two of you reconnected. That you had the connection, but it's two elite clubs that worked together a lot, did great things for our country, and were supportive of each other. I mean, I know how Jimmy feels about the 160th. He feels like he saved his life.
So I was on another podcast, Neutral Position, a guy named Nick Palmisano. He co-wrote Tim Kennedy's book, Scars and Stripes. And I flew down to North Carolina. I got in there and everything's going great. I'm having a good time in the podcast. And he said something like, what was your most rewarding missions? And I said, Kazovac, and as I'm describing why, I broke into tears. I couldn't stop. And I had never had that happen before, but I was talking about, I hope I don't do it now, but, I'd say, you got a guy, he's injured right in the middle of nowhere. And, I've got the medic on board, or the SRT, which is the surgical resuscitation team. And, we're going to go in, it's going to be a hot exfil. And if we don't get him, he will die and his family will not. And as I put it, is like his little girl isn't going to have a daddy to come home to. And that is one of those things. And so I'm writing my second book, and I talked to Jimmy about that. I was like, hey, part of one of the chapters is going to involve Kazovac, involving the medics and stuff. Would you like to talk about, what it's like, and he said, yeah, hell yeah. So I still got to get that.
That is fantastic. Well, I'll just tell you briefly that I knew Dave Ritchie and Cal through liaisoning when they'd come to Los Angeles. And so I'd known them for a while, especially Dave. And then I went back to Washington, D.C., to Arlington for the Extortion 17 funeral because the canine handler on there, Jet Li, John Durandara, he was someone I knew because he came to L.A. a few times. So some SWAT guys and I went to that funeral in our uniforms. Long story short, that night we're at a bar with after the funeral with a bunch of guys, and there's a bunch of SEAL team guys there, and they're talking about Jimmy Hatch. They're talking about how what happened to him, and I'm going, wow, I know Jimmy Hatch and from prior contact, and then they talk about the pilots by name. They talked about Dave Ritchie, and I'm sitting there just listening. I'm a fly on the wall here. I'm just keep my mouth shut. I'm going, oh my gosh, I know that pilot. And they just could not stop talking about your group of pilots and how valuable they were and how they saved lives and how they made a difference in not just Jimmy, but many, many others. And boy, that impacted me. And the next time I saw Dave, I asked him about that. I said, you know who Jimmy Hatch is? He goes, yes, I do. I go, you never told me about this. He said, you never asked me. It was like routine.
Yeah.
He said,
my wife does that all the time. She'll be, we'll encounter somebody she's never met. This is my second wife. And they'll bring up a story and she'll say, well, I never heard that story. I'm like, well, you never asked. it doesn't come up, in my mind. It's got to be brought up in conversation. And that's what I like about seeing some of the guys that I hadn't seen in a long time, like talking to Cal and Dave was amazing. Yeah, that's great bunch of guys.
You're in a very special club there, Al, and always will be. And we could talk to Al for the rest of the day, but he's a working man, unlike John.
I was going to say we're well past my lunch hour, but nobody's banged on my door, so we're
that's good. A good thing. That's a good thing. So, John, you want to? Do you have any closing thoughts before I wrap it?
Yeah, my closing thought, I guess, is kind of pertains to you and Jimmy and how you wrote your books. Your book again was amazing. Highly recommend folks pick the book up and read through it. One of the things that you and Jimmy both do in your book is you guys talk about the mental health side of things. That's a crucial part of our industry. I think we're working to normalize mental health and paying attention to that. You did a really good job of integrating that into your book. So thank you for doing that. We'll have to have you back on the podcast at some point to talk about how you did that and what that looks like.
That's probably a good next topic, talk about mental health and, family. I know that, firefighters and police officers have the same, exact problems when it comes to family and duty. What comes first? Your, the job, your partner, the family, and there's a lot to talk about there, a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
We'll definitely. You're always invited, Al. Anytime. There's so many more. I mean, we had pages of questions, and I'm glad we got to as many as we did. To tell you the truth.
Yeah, if you want to do some more, I mean, we could do something another month or two.
We will, but we will. But I'll wrap up just by saying, Razor 03, fantastic book, A Night Stalkers Wars by Alan Mack, and you can get it. You can get it a lot of places, but Alan C. Mack, Alan ALAN C. Mack.com. You can go learn more about Alan and more about his book. Highly recommend the book for tons of reasons. And one of the things that jumped out at me was the cover. The cover is fantastic, by the way. I don't know who designed that, but they were really good.
My editor did that. Yeah, that's me, by the way. So Cal, wait, I don't mean to interrupt you before you talk about the blurbs, but so Cal sent me a text just before we started this, and he's like, "Hey, they're probably going to show you pictures of Chinooks, and you'll probably claim it's you." And I was like, "No, Cal, I'll only pick the ones that look cool, and even if it's not me." And that's the thing. That's the big joke with me is I would always see a picture of a Chinook that looked cool, and I'd go, "Oh, that's me." And I would I'd especially say it if it was around the guy I knew it was. Yes, it wasn't me,
that's
right?
Perfect.
And then we fight back and forth a little bit. No, it was me. No, it was me. And then I always say, "Oh, yeah, they're out of trim." Meaning it's not flying right. Is that can't be me?
That's perfect. So this one is you. It's in trim, and it is you on the cover. But some of the endorsements. I mean, General Petraeus, Admiral McCraven. Those two alone are amazing. But one that jumps out at me that I'll finish with is from Doug Stanton, from the author of The Horse Soldiers. Mack fearlessly explores the terror and camaraderie of flying in the world's most elite aviation unit, for a truly dramatic behind-the-scenes look at some of the U.S.'s most secretive operations. Fearlessly explores terror and camaraderie. Boy, oh boy, does this book do that. And a lot more, but those are the things we talk about in law enforcement and certainly the military, that camaraderie. There are moments of terror, but boy, there's a lot of laughs. There's tears, there's tragedies, but in the end, it's a valuable thing that we're all doing. But certainly we want to thank you for everything you did. 35 years, 11 months, Al. That's a long time. You did more than your share for all of us. And John and I appreciate that personally. And we certainly appreciate you giving us the time that you did today. And we will get back together and talk about some more things. But thank you, Al, very, very much for joining us. This was great.
It was a lot of fun, and we definitely should do it again.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. John, good seeing you. Welcome back from Hawaii. Aloha.
All right. Aloha.
And until next time, everybody, thanks for listening to the Hangar Z podcast, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers.
Cheers. This is the end of our conversation with Alan Mack. Stand by for a message after word from our sponsors.
Thank you to our sponsor, CNC Technologies. CNC Technologies, serving law enforcement, government, and military markets with tailored mission solutions, system training, and live 24/7 support with CNC.live platform. Explore more at cnctechnologies.com. Thank you to our sponsors, MD Helicopters. MD Helicopters is a leading light helicopter manufacturer for civil and military operators worldwide. We build safe, agile, hard-working light helicopters that consistently deliver reliable performance. As a result, our operators enjoy superior confidence, backed by durability that enables more uptime. Thank you to our sponsor, Technisonic Communications. Technisonic Communications is a proud provider of the critical airborne communications equipment utilized every day on every mission. Law enforcement, EMS, forestry, federal and military operators all trust their communications to Technisonic. Visit TIL.ca to learn how Technisonic can support your mission communications.
Thank you for supporting the sponsors who make these awesome conversations with people like Alan Mack possible. I have some exciting news. The newest podcast that is part of the Vertical Helicast platform is now live. The Vertical MRO Podcast. The Vertical MRO Podcast explores the world of helicopter maintenance, repair, and overhaul. These episodes feature helicopter technicians, mechanics, engineers, and MRO experts who will share invaluable industry insight, knowledge, and stories that will inspire current and aspiring industry maintainers. This podcast is available on all major podcast platforms such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. For more information about the Vertical MRO podcast, go to verticalhelicast.com. Cheers.
Time to close up the hangar. Thanks for joining us on the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts.